In November 1942, during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the German forces in Stalingrad found themselves in an increasingly precarious situation. Despite their initial success, they were facing a severe lack of resources and logistical support. The German soldiers had already been fighting for months in harsh conditions, and their supplies were dwindling quickly. The Luftwaffe's efforts to deliver supplies by air were minimal, worsening the situation for the soldiers. As the weather worsened, temperatures plummeted, and snow covered the city. The soldiers were forced to endure extreme cold, which compounded the suffering caused by food shortages, overcrowding, and inadequate medical care. The harsh winter made their already fragile condition even worse, and they began to fall victim to various diseases. Typhus, pneumonia, and other infections spread rapidly among the soldiers. With no means to effectively treat the sick and wounded, many of them perished from injuries that would have been survivable under better conditions. As the months went by, the soldiers' situation continued to deteriorate. Starving, freezing, and falling ill, the German forces were becoming a shadow of their former selves. The death toll from starvation and disease was climbing, and morale was at an all-time low. On February 2, 1943, the Soviet forces officially declared victory. Generals Konstantin Rozovsky and Nikolai Voronov sent a message to Moscow announcing that the German Sixth Army had been defeated. This marked the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, which had lasted for months. For the Soviet troops, it was a moment of triumph. The streets of Stalingrad were eerily quiet, as most of the fighting had ceased. The battle, which had cost so many lives, had finally come to an end. Meanwhile, the German forces were in disarray after their surrender. As noted by Nikolai Koff, Chief of Staff of the 62nd Army, Soviet troops captured more than 40,000 German prisoners in one day, adding to the 50,000 already taken. The prisoners were exhausted, their faces showing the toll of months of intense fighting, starvation, and cold. Their surrender marked the end of an era for the German army, as the Sixth Army had once been considered one of its most formidable divisions. The prisoners, however, faced an uncertain and grim future. As they were rounded up, they could do little but take whatever scraps they could find to keep warm. Their conditions were horrific, with many already on the brink of death from malnutrition and disease. The prisoners, now a symbol of Germany's defeat, were taken to prisoner camps where they would be subjected to forced labor and harsh conditions. It was a bitter end to a once powerful fighting force. After the surrender of the German Sixth Army, the prisoners faced a dire fate. The German soldiers were forced to march hundreds of kilometers across snow-covered terrain. They moved through the bitter cold with little to no food or shelter. Many prisoners were already suffering from severe malnutrition, and the conditions only worsened as they trudged eastward. Their movements were slow, and the soldiers struggled to stay alive. The marchers, known as the Death March, took a heavy toll. As they were marched, many prisoners succumbed to exhaustion, disease, and the freezing temperatures. The death rate among the prisoners was horrifyingly high, with thousands perishing along the way. They were treated with brutality by their Soviet captors, who showed little compassion. Many of the prisoners who couldn't keep up or collapsed from fatigue were shot by the guards. The surviving prisoners could only move forward, often with little hope of survival. Once the prisoners arrived at the labor camps, their suffering continued. They were put to work in harsh conditions with inadequate food and medical care. The harsh weather, combined with grueling labor, led to further deaths. The prisoners had to endure terrible physical and mental hardship. Only a small fraction of the original 91,000 prisoners survived these long marches and the subsequent years in captivity. The Death March was one of the darkest chapters of World War II. The Soviet labor camps where German prisoners were sent were notorious for their harsh conditions. Once the prisoners arrived, they were subjected to grueling work in factories, mines, and infrastructure projects. The labor was exhausting, often lasting for 12 hours a day or more, regardless of the weather. The tools used were rudimentary, and the prisoners received little to no supervision, resulting in dangerous working conditions. Many prisoners succumbed to exhaustion. Food was extremely scarce in these camps. Prisoners were often given just a few grams of black bread mixed with sawdust, and occasionally some potatoes or beets. Medical care was almost non-existent. Infections that would have been treatable under normal circumstances became fatal due to the lack of proper treatment. Typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases spread rapidly, further depleting the already weak prisoners. The guards who supervised the camps were brutal and showed little compassion. Many of the guards considered the German prisoners to be responsible for the atrocities committed by the Nazis on Soviet soil. As a result, they often subjected them to harsh physical punishment and humiliation. Those who could not meet the harsh work quotas or showed signs of weakness were punished severely. Despite the brutal conditions, some prisoners managed to survive, though most did not. The survivors faced years of physical and mental hardship. The conditions in the Soviet labor camps were a constant reminder of the high human cost of war. Friedrich Paulus, the German general who surrendered at Stalingrad, faced immense hardship in Soviet captivity. After his capture, he was taken to a Soviet POW camp. Despite being a high-ranking officer, his treatment was brutal and his condition deteriorated rapidly. The Soviets used his capture for propaganda, displaying him to the public as a symbol of Nazi defeat. His ordeal in captivity became a testament to the harsh reality of Soviet prisoner camps. Paulus's surrender marked the first time a German field marshal had been taken prisoner, and he became a key figure in Soviet efforts to demonstrate the superiority of their army. During his captivity, Paulus was subjected to intense interrogations. The Soviets tried to use him to further their political agenda, urging him to denounce Hitler and the Nazi regime. However, Paulus was reluctant to publicly align himself with the Soviets. In 1953, after nearly 10 years of imprisonment, Paulus was released, coinciding with the easing of tensions between the Soviet Union and West Germany. His return to Germany was marked by bitter disillusionment. The country he returned to had changed drastically. His reputation was controversial, and he struggled to reintegrate into post-war Germany. Paulus's post-war life was a complex journey of reflection. His experiences in captivity haunted him for the rest of his life. His status as a high-ranking officer made him a symbol, but it also led to a life filled with psychological and emotional scars. He passed away in 1957, leaving behind a legacy marked by both heroism and tragedy. Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, a senior German officer, became a controversial figure after his capture by Soviet forces. Unlike many of his comrades, Seydlitz-Kurzbach chose to collaborate with the Soviets. He was summoned by the Red Army's High Command and urged to convince other German officers to join their efforts against Hitler. Seydlitz-Kurzbach's collaboration was a bold move, and he played a significant role in the Soviet propaganda campaign to undermine Nazi Germany. His collaboration with the Soviets included participating in radio broadcasts aimed at the Wehrmacht. The Soviets hoped that by using his position, they could weaken the morale of German troops. This act of defection earned Seydlitz-Kurzbach disdain from many in Germany, where he was considered a traitor. His family faced persecution, and he was stripped of his citizenship and sentenced to death in absentia by the Nazi regime. Despite his efforts to end the war through collaboration, Seydlitz-Kurzbach's influence within the Soviet system was limited. The League of German Officers, an organization created to resist Hitler from within, had little support. Stalin's distrust of rearming German prisoners led to the failure of their efforts. Ultimately, Seydlitz-Kurzbach's attempts to undermine the Nazi regime were deemed unsuccessful. In the years after the war, Seydlitz-Kurzbach's reputation remained highly controversial. He was imprisoned by the Soviets and later released in 1956. His return to Germany was marked by a complex legacy of betrayal and loyalty. Despite his efforts, his actions remained a contentious topic in post-war Germany. The Babi-Yar massacre, a horrific event during World War II, took place in 1941 when Nazi forces occupied Ukraine. Following an explosion that destroyed the German army headquarters in Kiev, the Nazis implemented a systematic plan to annihilate the city's Jewish population. The victims, mostly Jews, were rounded up, forced to march to the ravine at Babi-Yar, and executed. Over 30,000 Jews were murdered within 2 days in this brutal massacre. The atrocities did not stop with the Jews. The Germans also targeted Romani people, Soviet Poles, and anyone who opposed the regime. As the massacre continued, local collaborators and Ukrainian nationalists helped the Nazis in carrying out these executions. Babi-Yar became a mass grave for thousands of innocent victims. The horror of this massacre was one of the most notorious acts of the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. In addition to the mass killings, the Nazis forced the remaining prisoners to exhume bodies from the mass graves. They cremated the remains to cover up their crimes. Despite the efforts to erase evidence, the scale of the massacre could not be hidden. By the end of 1941, Babi-Yar had witnessed the death of nearly 100,000 people, though some estimates suggest the number could be higher. The war's aftermath saw the prosecution of war criminals, including those responsible for the Babi-Yar massacre. The Soviet Union held trials for Nazi collaborators and those who helped in the persecution of the population. The crimes committed at Babi-Yar remain a stark reminder of the horrors of war. After World War II, many German prisoners of war were not released immediately, despite the Geneva Convention stipulations. Instead, they were held in Soviet captivity for several years. The release process was slow, with many prisoners, especially officers, remaining in camps until the mid-1950s. During their captivity, prisoners faced harsh labor conditions and political trials. The Soviet authorities viewed these prisoners not just as captives, but also as labor resources for post-war reconstruction. They were forced to work on various projects, including rebuilding cities destroyed by the war, constructing infrastructure, and working in heavy industries. Many of these prisoners endured severe conditions with inadequate food and shelter. Disease was rampant, and many prisoners perished from exhaustion, malnutrition, or illness. When the prisoners were finally released, their return to Germany was bittersweet. They arrived in a country devastated by war, struggling to rebuild. Many faced suspicion and mistrust from the German public, as some were believed to have collaborated with the Soviets during their captivity. The reintegration process was difficult, and many survivors suffered from long-term psychological trauma, including PTSD. In 1955, after years of negotiations, the last German prisoners were repatriated. Their return marked the end of a dark chapter in post-war history. However, many still carried the scars of their experiences. The trauma of their years in captivity continued to affect them, shaping their lives long after the war's end. The Battle of Stalingrad, a turning point in World War II, left a lasting impact. Not only did it signify a major defeat for the German army, but its aftermath was catastrophic. The German Sixth Army, once one of the most powerful divisions, was destroyed, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The battle itself left Stalingrad in ruins, with both soldiers and civilians suffering immensely. The city was obliterated, its infrastructure completely destroyed. In the months following the battle, the consequences for both the victors and the vanquished were severe. For the Germans, the defeat in Stalingrad led to the loss of over 400,000 soldiers. The Wehrmacht struggled to replace these losses, as experienced troops were replaced by recruits. The defeat shattered the morale of the German public and soldiers alike. Hitler's reputation among his allies and citizens was deeply damaged. Meanwhile, the Soviet victory bolstered morale within the Red Army and the Soviet populace. It demonstrated the strength and resilience of the Soviet forces. The victory was not only a strategic military success, but also a major propaganda tool for the Soviet regime. Stalingrad's devastation also symbolized the brutality of the war, with its legacy of death, destruction, and trauma continuing to affect the survivors long after the last shots had been fired. The battle and its aftermath changed the course of the war on the Eastern Front. The losses suffered by Germany in Stalingrad marked a significant shift, leading to a series of Soviet victories that would eventually bring them to Berlin.